Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Ian. I'm a sophomore studying physics at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located both on the park side and on the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag JFKJuniorForumLive, which is also listed in your program. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming Ed Balls, Harriet Cross, Amanda Sloat, and tonight's moderator, Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook.
Well, good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you to this John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. I am Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook. I am the Executive Director of the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship here at the Kennedy School, based at the Belfer Center, and also the Executive Director of the Future of Diplomacy Project, similarly based at the Belfer Center. We have a discussion that's succinctly titled Brexit, What's Next? And so we're going to try to keep this conversation engaging and hopefully add some clarity to what has been a very confusing set of years. So you can already see my panel's shaking its head. Let me introduce you to my excellent panelists who I'm thrilled to have up on stage with me. Right to my left is Harriet Cross. None of these three people are strangers to many of you here. She is Her Majesty's Government's Consul General to New England, connecting the United Kingdom with the 6 New England states. She has a distinguished diplomatic career, serving before she came here both in North Africa and in the Middle East. And we were just discussing that in addition to her government portfolio, she has a particular perspective on Brexit because she's from Yorkshire and she owns a microbrewery. So economic effects notwithstanding, she will have her own views as a private person. Right in the middle of our panel is Ed Balls, who is truly not a stranger to this environment, in part because he is an alumnus of the school. He graduated in 1990 with his MPA2. That's the one thing that we have in common, the MPA2, and has gone on to hold very rich portfolios throughout government. He was, until the fated 2015 election, the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, and has since then engaged very richly with some of you in this room, has written a number of very serious research papers on the economic consequences of Brexit as a fellow in the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Business and Government here. He also holds an appointment at King's College, and so we're thrilled that Ed could be with us this evening. All the way to my far left is Dr. Amanda Sloat. For the purposes of this evening, I am claiming her as part of the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship, where she is a fellow, but she is also one of the 2 Robert Bosch Senior Fellows at the Brookings Institution. She was, before that, a fellow at the Ash Center, so she too has a long connection now to the Kennedy School. She served in the US government for 10 years. Her focus was on Europe and Eurasia, but Amanda comes to this particular perspective because she did her PhD on the devolution of the Scottish Parliament and then did her postdoc work in Belfast. So she has a very practical, on-the-ground experience on the issue as well. So please join me in welcoming this panel. While we want to, of course, look ahead, I did want to take this panel back a few months to a few years to try to explore together in 3 minutes each, how did we end up in this situation, which The Economist calls a cluster shambles, which I think is a diplomatic formulation for, truthfully, a very difficult situation in which we now find ourselves. No matter how you come at this situation, whether you're looking at it from across the channel as someone who is in the European Union or the other way around, or even from this side of the Atlantic. So I thought I'd start with Harriet to give us a flavor of the dynamic. What are the underlying dynamics that brought this situation into sort of the developments that we have now.
Okay, so I'll start by putting something aside that I'm not going to talk about that maybe some of my colleagues on the panel will, which is party political politics. I think that played a huge role in where we are today, but that's not really within my remit as British Consul General. So I'll put that aside, but please recognise that I'm very cognizant of it. I think the other thing to make you aware of before I start to talk about the referendum itself is that the UK was always within a kind of multi-track EU. So there were always different grades of EU membership. They weren't seen as such. It was all very informal. But if you think of way from the beginning, the UK's challenges with its identity in relation to the EU have really always been there since the start. And the UK wasn't a member of the Schengen area. The UK decided not to be part of the Eurozone. And I think that's quite a significant foundation before we start to think about the specific reasons why the people voted to leave the EU. So I think if, as I say, I'll leave the how we got to the referendum aside, because I do think that is quite largely party political. And go on to why the people voted as they did. And I would say the big factors were borders, so that's immigration, sovereignty, and money. Now, whether they voted for the right or wrong reasons in relation to those three areas is, again, I won't give a judgment on that. But I think the people who did vote felt really strongly on both sides. It was a really emotional response to the question, do you want to stay in Europe or not? And I think there are definitely some parallels with recent US elections in that regard. It was about a whole lot more than Europe. It was definitely about people feeling left behind with the direction the world was going in. And I think that was, to a certain extent, one of the reasons why they voted as they did. Another thing is marketing. I really genuinely believe that the marketing made a massive difference to the Brexit vote, above and beyond the substantive reasons. So the Leave campaign, their kind of headline was "Take Back Control." Fantastic, strong, powerful, clear. Why do we need to take it back? Because somebody's taken it from us. It was really powerful. I couldn't even tell you what the Remain banner was. It was probably something like, Europe is a very important institution, that it is economically potentially in some ways beneficial to the UK. You know, it was just not as snappy and as catchy and as easy to understand, and I think that was really significant, and I don't think that was a side issue at all. I think those sorts of things are really important. So that's another point, and I think it's worth watching. Is it called Brexit? The program that Benedict Cumberbatch stars in. I think it's on Netflix at the moment. Worth watching that, because I think that particularly gives a really good perspective on the campaigns for both sides and why the Leave campaign was ultimately so much more successful. I'll put aside any question of the outside interference, because there were other dynamics as well. But again, I've only got 3 minutes, so I won't go into that. I think finally, one of the things that I do want to make clear is that I think the people who voted Leave weren't voting against the people of the EU. I really remember one, it was probably the Radio 4 Today programme, because that's my kind of go-to for my news, and they were interviewing people pre the referendum, and they went to a factory in the northeast and interviewed some of the people there, and they said, do you want to leave the EU or not? Yeah, we want to leave. Why do you want to leave? Because of all the foreign workers that are coming in and taking our jobs. And they said, oh, but you've got a really high percentage of Polish workers here, so you're talking about these Polish workers. And they said, oh no, not these Polish workers. No, not the ones on my conveyor belt. I really like them. No, it's the other ones. So it's this whole question of, the unknown foreigner. And I think actually the British people have a lot of affinity with the EU. We go on holiday there. We've got a lot of shared values, shared interests. We do a lot together on the global stage. And it wasn't because the British people wanted to move away from the EU themselves, and nor was it a protectionist thing. That's something else that I find challenging in my role, that people, I think they sometimes align the Brexit vote with some of the protectionism that's happening in the US, so that the British government, and certainly the British people, want to be out there on the world stage. They want to be trading openly, and they want to be doing business. But for all the reasons I laid out earlier on, they didn't want to do that as part of the EU. So I'll stop there. I think I've had at least 3 minutes.
For the Labour Party, if you will, this is they should have maybe gone into this referendum steely-eyed and clear-minded. After all, of course, this is the second, or was the second referendum that we had, if you will, on EU membership. 79, hard-fought campaign in its own right. Lots of influence back then from the outside as well. We had a different media environment because the continent actually helped ultimately get the vote across the line back then, 79. Ed, what's your read now, 2 years after we've called Article 50? How do you read it looking back? How did you read it at the time?
Well, I agree with everything Harriet said, and but I can talk about the party politics and the Labour and the Conservative politics, so I will kind of take it on from there. I think the reality is that this is a perfect storm. A perfect disastrous storm in Britain for a range of separate factors which all come together, of history, of global trends, of particularly British and European policy, and then of politics. And just to take them within my 3 minutes very quickly. First of all, a historic ambivalence of Britain towards engagement with Europe, which goes back centuries, but certainly was dominant in the 20th century. Post-war leaderships of Labour and Conservative parties were deeply ambivalent about Britain's relationship with the European Union. But that ambivalence, although, as you said, it was very hard for the Labour Party in the 1970s, in the 70s, it was Labour which became the anti-European party. This was, for most of the period, a pragmatic ambivalence. You had a core group in our society, maybe 20%, 25%, who were deeply against, and a core group in society who were strongly in favour of membership, which is probably considerably less than 20%, and a pragmatic centre. And that framed, all the time I was in government, it was hard going to Brussels to negotiate, because the view was always, if you agree, you must have sold out the national interest, and it's only by being isolated for a period you can really defend the national interest before you agree. That underlying ambivalence has been there throughout this period. But that became a particular problem and a particular crisis progressively in the 90s and 2000s for the Conservative Party, whose members were disproportionately in that anti-European 20%. David Cameron, when he was elected leader of the Conservative Party in 2004-05, said he was the leader who was finally going to stop the Conservative Party banging on about Europe, and clearly that didn't work out very well. Secondly, global trends. The Trump effect, what we're seeing in continental Europe and in Britain after the financial crisis, a reaction against establishment leadership, a sense amongst populations they work hard and don't get better off, and a fear, especially among people who are older, living outside core cities, that change is rapid and destabilising and symbolised by immigration. Those are common trends, absolutely central to the Brexit vote. Take Back Control was the equivalent of Donald Trump's wall. It was about immigration. Third thing, though, particularly about policy, first of all, we made a decision in 2004, the British government, not to have controls on East European migration. We had decided not to join the euro, the right decision. We decided to show that we were in favour of enlargement, not to have the controls. At the time, we thought the numbers would be small. They turned out to be very large, and very large in particular in the second wave of the Eurozone crisis in 2012, 13, 14, when the numbers really spiked up again. About the time that David Cameron was making a decision to try and hold his party together on the European issue by calling a referendum. Every political party leader since Wilson had always wondered about, should you try to bind the country together or solve a political problem through a referendum? Nobody had done it until David Cameron. Right. I think that was, in retrospect, a huge political mistake. But that mistake of leadership was happening at the same time, as you said, that the Labour Party was electing as its leader somebody who had consistently, for 30 years, been anti-European. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's views on this subject are very, very well known. Put that all together, what do you get? You end up with a referendum at a time of rising populist pressure, with a lot of concern about globalization and global trends, but particularly around migration, with a Conservative leader saying, stick to the status quo because it's good for you, it's the best you're going to get. Fundamentally, the choice was status quo with Cameron, change and control with Leave, and we all know the status quo is not a compelling argument today in British politics, and at a time when the Labour leadership was muted in its view on the European issue, such that most Labour supporters didn't know what Labour's view was in the referendum. And I'm afraid, in a circumstance where the choice is status quo or change wins. And that's what happened with the Leave vote in 2016.
We'll talk a little bit about the impact that this has on governance going forward and the sort of fractious elements, I think, in the party political landscape. But Amanda, as somebody who has seen this both from the inside, you know, there were all the pieces and components that were made around, or the arguments made around the fact that a lot of this is happening, particularly in the UK, or this thinking, because you have an unwritten constitution, you have these components between the understanding of sovereignty in relationship to the European Union. And then you also have, from your professional vantage point, the European view in terms of what was going on, you know, in these debates. Cameron had been negotiating for months in advance of the referendum, of course. That was the one play, right? The play was that he was going to get a better deal for the UK, and that was going to be the perhaps ameliorated status quo. How did it play out from your vantage point?
Well, the problem with answering these questions last is everything, of course, has already been said. But let me try and add a couple of things. One, as you mentioned on the differences within the UK, I think it's important to remember that Scotland voted overwhelmingly to stay in, 63%. And so one thing we can talk about is the potential implications that this is going to have for calls for future independence in Scotland and what that looks like. Northern Ireland also voted by a smaller majority, but did vote to stay in. And we can come back and talk about the Northern Ireland aspects of this, but interestingly, Northern Ireland was one of the facets that was not really discussed during the referendum campaign, and yet it has proven to be the biggest stumbling block in terms of finding a deal and a way forward in Brexit. There was a majority in England to leave. There was also a majority in Wales to leave. There was a vote in London to stay. So you've got a lot of regional disparity in terms of the way people approach this question, which is affecting the way I think attitudes are playing out with this. And I think also, as Ed and Harriet was alluding to, there have been some similarities in the way these debates have been playing out in the US. One thing I think you saw in Brexit, and Harriet alluded to this a little bit, is there was an element of disinformation. People did not necessarily know what all of the consequences were going to be. There's been lots of coverage of people not realizing that they were going to be losing their structural funding, that they were not necessarily going to be able to live and travel, that people that were living in Spain, for example, were not necessarily going to get access to the National Health Service in the absence of a deal. So there was some genuine disinformation. I think there was some, I don't know what euphemism we're using for lying these days, but inaccurate information given. For example, that all of this money was going to come back and fund the NHS, and you ended up seeing people that were heading the Leave campaign acknowledging literally the day after the referendum that was not necessarily going to be the case. There was also evidence of Russian interference in the referendum campaign. We've seen this with some of the Cambridge Analytica information that was coming out. It's unclear to what extent that ended up affecting what the ultimate vote outcomes were, but there does appear to have been an influence there as well. And then just to bring it back to an American context, I think there's also similarities to what we are seeing in the UK and what we're seeing in the US. In both countries, you have an extremely divided population. I think the same way the election in the US was extremely divisive, the referendum in the UK was very divisive. It was a 52-48% result, so it was extremely close. you were seeing, as they were saying, the impacts of immigration. What's interesting is you're seeing that play out in Europe, you're seeing that play out in the UK, and you're seeing it in the US, but all in very different ways. In the US, the question, of course, is of our southern border of Latin America. In Europe, particularly in Germany, you had a lot of questions of Syrian refugees and refugees that were coming in, which didn't affect the UK in the same way. But the issue there, as Ed was alluding to, was the proverbial Polish plumber. This idea that people were coming from Eastern Europe and taking jobs. The other similarity, of course, was this idea of sovereignty. A lot of concern about outside influence, about, and part of this, I think, has been a problem with the way British and I think other European governments have tended to demonize Brussels as this foreign decision maker that is imposing things. And I think it's very easy for people to forget they've got members of the European Parliament, they've got ministers taking these decisions. And so it's not necessarily all being externally imposed, but I think British leaders have done the country a disservice by blaming all of the unpopular straight cucumber and regulations and things that people don't like on these faceless bureaucrats in Brussels.
Let's stay on that for just a second because of your particular perspective. Did the European Union, did Brussels, did leaders in other parts of the Union read this situation correctly at the time? If we think about the 79 referendum, it helped that the continent had a lot of empathy for the questions at the time. We saw Helmut Schmidt, people were campaigning for Great Britain to stay in. Did they read the situation? Did the thermometer rise enough as we were hedging to the date in June to understand what could come?
I mean, Ed in living there may have a better sense of how Europe was getting involved in the campaign. My own sense, and if I was living in Europe, is at a certain point, it's like, do you want to be in? Do you don't? Right? It's like you're married, but you can't sleep around with everybody else. Like you sort of have to make some certain commitments if you're going to be in. And my sense with the EU is that they were willing. Margaret Thatcher got a rebate. The UK was not in the euro, which is a requirement for all countries coming in. They were not in the Schengen arrangement. David Cameron was trying to negotiate a deal on migration. And I think there really has always been an attitude within the UK of wanting to cherry pick some of the best deals. And so I think while the EU recognized the economic and the political benefit of having the UK in, at a certain point, once you are in this system, it binds you to certain rights and responsibilities. And so my sense is that the EU was willing to do what it could. I think there is scope to criticize the EU for the way they have handled these Brexit negotiations now, in the sense that there has been an argument from the UK side that they wanted to discuss the divorce arrangements and the future relationship at the same time. And I think the EU was very clear that they wanted to finalize the divorce before they started talking about the future. And I think a lot of the debate that we are having about the Northern Ireland backstop is actually a discussion about the future relationship, even though it's actually preventing us from finalizing the divorce. And so that, you could argue, is a place that maybe the EU mishandled things.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that in a second. We're now less than 50 days out from March 29th. And still, if we look at what's on Theresa May's docket, it looks like a Rubiks Cube that if she moves it in one direction, it just changes color, it changes impact on one side or the other. So let's look a little bit at how this Rubiks Cube works and the options that are in front of her that present themselves to her. We've had a fair amount of bad news over the past week, including the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, saying, look, the growth projections are going to look much smaller potentially than we imagined. We're going to see a contraction of the UK economy, which, we could hedge. Ed and his student colleagues here wrote a paper of how that is going to affect specifically small and medium-sized enterprises. There was some scrambling over the weekend, meetings in Ireland, as Amanda alluded to, and then, of course, some meetings in Strasbourg today. We have the Prime Minister coming out to give a report of whatever these talks may have yielded, and then possibly a vote on Thursday. But does she have, what are her options? How does this Rubiks Cube turn now, Ed? And when can we play out for the next 50 days?
Well, we have a majoritarian parliamentary system in which the governing party has to get its legislation through by winning a majority. So therefore, in British politics, it all starts with numbers. And can you get a majority? And that's where you have to start off with analysing this issue. And let's take, I could tell you what Theresa May should have done 2 years ago, what David Cameron should have done 4 years ago, but let's accept we are where we are. I think in the House of Commons now, even though a majority of members of Parliament voted to stay in the European Union, I think as of now there is a majority to leave, because very many people think at a time when the governing class is under huge pressure, simply to ignore the result of a referendum and try and refight the referendum is very divisive. That is not a universal view, of course. There is a majority to leave, but that majority comes from both sides of the House, because we have a majoritarian system, but also it's also a party system. And normally our politics works with the party uniting to put legislation through against the opposition party uniting to oppose. At the moment, the divides in our country between cities and towns, old and young, those split both of the main political parties, and that makes the task of leadership for Theresa May and for Jeremy Corbyn very hard indeed. I think there is a majority to leave, but there is, as of today, no majority for leaving in any particular way. Every time so far a view has been put as to how we should leave, that has been defeated. On the other hand, I think you could also say there's no majority in the House of Commons today to just throw it all up in the air and have another general election and see if you can change the arithmetic.
Yeah.
And I think as of today, there is also no majority for saying, let's just have a referendum again and repeat 2016. So that means we're quite stuck. I think there is a majority for extending the time period, if our European partners will allow us to, from the end of March, potentially, although that got defeated a couple of weeks ago. If Theresa May proposed that, she would get that through, but she's worried at the moment that would be weakening for her. I think there is also a majority for a deal where Britain stays in the customs union, the trade arrangement, but is outside the European Union, outside the full single market. The problem is that majority only comes from a combination of Conservative votes and Labour votes. And if that was to happen, Theresa May would be the Prime Minister who got a deal through at the expense of deeply, potentially irrevocably splitting her own party. And Jeremy Corbyn would be in a position where he would support a deal, but hugely alienating a very large part of his party in the country. So your difficulty is to get to a deal, both leaders have to accept a potentially catastrophic split. Nobody wants to do that, and therefore we're edging towards this precipice moment. Question mark, could we just crash out with no deal? That is a disastrous outcome. It's the default outcome. I think the one thing you can say absolutely is that there is not a majority in the House of Commons for that. And therefore, in my view, if Theresa May tries to play that to the wire, she'll get defeated and no deal will be taken off the table. We'll extend. Her gamble, though, is if she takes it right up to the wire, she can persuade some Labour people to join her and persuade the right of her party who want a hard Brexit to join her. And I think she's playing a game of chicken. And it is, in Britain, it's incredibly destabilising, because if you are a public servant or a business person, you've got absolutely no idea what is going to be happening, the rules of the game, our trading relations. If you're a police officer, police chief, you've no idea what legal framework you'll be operating in 8 weeks' time. So the government, is choosing to play a game of chicken with fundamental aspects of our nationhood. Theresa May's calculation is that is the only way she can get a deal through without splitting her party. But I mean, it's the ultimate political gamble.
Yes, it's brinksmanship as it's defined by Merriam-Webster dictionary, essentially. Harriet, looking at these difficult options that she faces, there is, of course, that small and now entirely major issue of the Irish backstop, because as we rail to it, some people are saying, look, maybe we'll get to, the European Council on March 21st, and the Europeans will get so panicky, to Ed's point, that they will easily, in a sort of last-minute saving gesture, grant the Article 50 extension. But, there's a lot of negotiation games being played, in part, of course, for the Europeans, to make sure that no other country comes up with what the Europeans consider a very bad idea again. So they are going to continue to hold the Prime Minister's feet to the fire. So as someone who looks at it from a diplomatic angle, who looks at the conversations that were had in Ireland, the guarantees that were made yet again from Brussels to the Taoiseach, and then how you handle that delicate situation, because truthfully we might end up with this no-deal Brexit, and then we'll still end up with half a foot of the United Kingdom within a customs union. So how does that square, and how do you evaluate the negotiations that are going on?
Okay, so how does that square is the question. Theresa May has been really clear about the Irish backstop, to the extent that she said, we will not have a hard border on the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. That is really has been clearly stated and backed up by her ministers. That links into her saying that we will not damage the Good Friday Agreement in any way. We are still fully committed to the Good Friday Agreement. Now, she's also said she's now got a mandate from Parliament to go back and to revisit that backstop agreement. So that's another of her, that's the third objective. So now, bearing in mind that I need to protect those two first objectives, I now need to go back and find, quote, alternative arrangements for this backstop. And so that's what she's been doing the last few days. So as I understand it, the latest position is that the EU has said we do not want to reopen the withdrawal agreement, but there might be scope to put some language in the political statement which might give enough reassurance, and it needs to be a legally binding amount of reassurance to make this work. I think a positive is that the Irish government and the UK government are talking to each other and are they both want the same outcome to a certain extent, which is peace in Northern Ireland, and I absolutely agree that the Good Friday Agreement needs to be inviolable. It has to stand. But what the solutions are to making those three objectives work together, I don't know, and that's all to play for at the moment. I think the other thing that, and Amanda, you really alluded to this, is that the backstop is not this thing that will come in on the 30th of March. I think sometimes it's talked about as if it's a real thing that will suddenly appear once we leave. It's an insurance policy that if it even happens at all, wouldn't happen until at the end of 2020, if we didn't manage to find some arrangements in the intervening 20 months, assuming we left on the 29th of March with an agreement, you've got that transitional period where nothing changes. The UK is outside the EU, but all the standards, all the trading goes on as if you're inside the EU for 20 months. And so the backstop is far in the distance and can be extended further as need be. So it's actually quite incredible that such a, almost an illusionary in a way, but vitally critical element is really now the grit in all this.
Well, fundamentally, the problem is that Theresa May, and you can't say this, is not in the end being as straight as she needs to be with her own party about this issue. The fact is, if you have a border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, but we're all in the EU, then people can just drive across it. The moment you leave the European Union as Britain, as the UK, with Ireland staying in, well, inevitably, a border has to be erected. Right. But a border being erected is a catastrophe. How do you solve that? Well, you solve that if you're going to leave by having a customs union, which effectively means, for customs purposes, you don't need to have that border. And the European Union is saying, well, if you can't agree to that, we will have a backstop, which de facto says you're effectively in a customs union. Yeah. So if the solution is having a customs union, and the backstop is, in the meantime, having a customs union, the conclusion is the only way to leave is to have a customs union. And if you leave without a customs union or on no deal, then you break Theresa May's red line, you have to erect a border between north and south, and that's a catastrophe. So what's going on at the moment is the Prime Minister is telling a group of people on their own side, don't worry, I will square the circle. But it can't be
and
squared.
yet it is nothing but a circular argument. I think you've
exactly.
nicely illustrated that. Amanda, you've just come back from Northern Ireland and from seeing these questions on the ground. And your piece is that it's not just this question, that there could be other elements now that are causing some upheaval that could raise questions behind the stability of the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah, let me say a couple things. One, on the question of getting the EU 27 to delay. One piece that I think is important to keep in mind that is in the EU mind is that there are European Parliament elections in May. And so it is one thing to let the UK delay for a couple of weeks, because once they adopt the withdrawal agreement, they still have to pass implementing legislation, and the European Parliament still needs to ratify. So it's one thing to have a technical delay of a couple of weeks. From the EU's perspective, if you start delaying past May and into July, what happens with the European Parliament? Do Brits stand for election in the European Parliament? What happens if they leave? Those seats were going to be reallocated. Second, I've always been somewhat sympathetic to the Katza, or the TARP analogy in the United States with the vote. If you think back to 2008, with the financial bailout agreement, the House of Representatives took a principled vote, voted against the financial bailout. It was passed in the Senate. There was a small tweak. Then there was a credible amount of pressure on people in the House coming from both candidate Obama and President Bush, and it was ratified. So one possible scenario that I think we could see next month. On Northern Ireland specifically, the other problem that Theresa May has is she's created what some think tank analysts have referred to as a trilemma, which is that she has three incompatible goals. One is she wants to prevent a hard border in Northern Ireland. Two, she wants to pull the UK out of the customs union so that the UK can regain its economic sovereignty to make trade arrangements. And third, and most critically, she does not want Northern Ireland to be treated differently from the rest of the UK. Part of this has been made more complicated by the fact that when she held snap elections after she became Prime Minister, she had a pretty disastrous result. The Conservative Party lost its majority in Parliament, and so she became dependent on 10 members from the hardline Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland to preserve her majority within government. And they're the ones that have been very hardline on not wanting Northern Ireland to be treated separately from the rest of the UK. When I was last in Northern Ireland, and it was quite striking, having lived there 20 years ago, moving there right before 9/11. The beauty of the Good Friday Agreement was that you could be British, you could be Irish, and these questions of identity and constitution didn't matter. Unionists could actively participate in the power-sharing government in Stormont and know that there was not going to be a violent push to change the constitutional question in Northern Ireland. It was only going to be resolved by a referendum. If you were nationalist, if you were Catholic, you could take comfort in the fact that you now had an active role in political institutions, in the police, in a way that you didn't in the past. And the thing that I think is hard for people living outside Northern Ireland to understand is that while there's been all of this talk about the border, it has been very destabilizing to politics in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland has been without a government for over 2 years. Last summer, it actually set the world record for being the longest government that was not effectively standing. So there is no local governance in Northern Ireland. A couple weeks ago, there was a car bomb in Derry, the second largest city in Northern Ireland. I suspect most of you don't know about this. It didn't make national news in the US. It barely made national news in the UK. This is something that would have been significant news in the past as well. And so things are very destabilized there. And you're starting to see opinion polls coming out. One that was quite striking showed that an overwhelming majority of people that supported Brexit in Northern Ireland have said that giving up the peace process is a price that is willing to pay to implement Brexit. At the same time, you see an increase in people in Northern Ireland that would support reunification if there was going to be a hard border in Northern Ireland. And so this is having a significant impact on politics in Northern Ireland that I think is much more broad than what people tend to see when you focus on the very economics of the issue of the customs union.
We want to spend our third round very quickly talking about the effects on governance and on the economy before we come to you. So if you have questions, now is the time to get them ready. We have 4 microphones positioned around the forum. Remember that as you line up, you remember to introduce yourself and make sure that whatever you say ends in a question mark. And since we're a partially British panel, pithy is good. So while we do this last round, now is your time time to get your questions ready. Ed, there was a fevered letter exchange, perhaps maybe not fevered, but at least active, between Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May over these last couple of days. And your wife, Yvette Cooper, had a very specific view on what her party leader sent over as well. And this gets back to whether or not what is being thought out is schizophrenic and fractious. It's definitely fractious, but what might come out of this? So Jeremy Corbyn came out with sort of 5 demands, and that will let me toss to Harriet in just a minute. Part of it was around the security piece, which is to say he wanted very much that Theresa May push that the United Kingdom stay in EU security arrangements such as the European arrest warrant. Those are big issues for the national security of the United Kingdom, but again, wanted a customs union, wanted other specificities that are, again, ruffling party feathers. And so it's a question for you to reflect on that exchange, but also there's been a move over the weekend to think about, is this the nucleus or beginning of a different set of party politics within? There was a question over the weekend whether we could see the emergence of another new party, or whether this is now the future moment of the Lib Dems. What is this going to mean long term for the governance and the political dynamics in the House of Commons?
I think it's potentially very dangerous and unstable for a long period of time. And I think probably this is the aspect which is most uncertain and hard to read. I think if you look at the economy, first of all, a no-deal Brexit would be deeply destabilising, but actually a Brexit which is along the lines of the Jeremy Corbyn letter or the Theresa May Chequers deal, in my personal view, it would be less good than staying in, but actually it wouldn't be catastrophic, and it would impact over a long period of time. Part of the problem that the economic effects come through very slowly. I think most people in Britain at the moment would say, you told us, George Osborne, 2 years ago, it would be a disaster, and so far we've not noticed much difference. And I think that may carry on unless we have a catastrophe of no deal for a long period of time. So the economic effects are not likely to be, in my view, destabilising in a sort of drastic way. And I think we will undoubtedly lose influence as a country in global fora. But most people in Britain are not particularly going to notice that either. But our politics could go into a period of prolonged instability. It's very hard to see how Theresa May now gets a deal through the House of Commons which doesn't lead to a real sense of betrayal from the right of her party on customs union or the backstop or some kind of customs type arrangement. Right. If Jeremy Corbyn allows Labour MPs to join Theresa May, that is going to cause kind of huge problems in a section of the Labour Party. I think we could end up with both of our parties being riven and divided for a long period of time. That could lead to new parties, but frankly, that was tried in Britain 30 years ago, and it didn't work very well with the SDP. I think there was a lot of caution about going down that road. It could lead to the emergence of new parties other than, a new populist party other than the mainstream Labour or Conservative Party, a new populist party, if there is a sense of betrayal, which is quite a dangerous outcome. Or it may just be that both of our parties are sort of stuck with a betrayal narrative, and in those terms, it's quite hard to govern effectively. I mean, the answer, if we're leaving, is to find a way in which we can leave, which allows us to address some of the underlying concerns and complaints which the population have about the way in which our country's been run and whether they've had a fair deal, and about how globalisation is managed, about whether people feel as though they get better off, whether they get treated fairly, whether they can trust government. It's hard to do that when your party system is fracturing before our eyes. So that's the reason why I think this is really worrying and concerning.
Well, for saying that Ed thinks that the economic effects will be slow going, there is, of course, a lot of work being done within, or enough, hopefully, being done in various cabinet offices to try to figure out, what happens on the 29/30th to kind of insulate from these effects. As someone who has part of her portfolio the economic relationship between the United Kingdom and certainly businesses here, big tech, big pharma, what's your sense of the feeling of the people that you interact with here and there in terms of, is enough being done? Have we thought this out? Is there preparation in case we do end up with a no-deal Brexit and a lack of extension?
Yeah. So there's a lot of preparation, and one of my core tasks is to speak to businesses in New England and say which part of this, and clearly the uncertainty is the big picture, but which part of it is most concerning to you. So here in New England, I guess the life sciences industry is the one that is most concerned about the kind of standards. So if you've got a US manufacturing company, it manufactures pharmaceuticals in the UK, a lot of its business goes out to the EU. What happens? Are we still going to be able to sell our pharmaceuticals into the EU? So that's one strand of it. I have actually been really pleased that we've got really stretching targets in the consulate. We have to hit, hundreds of millions of dollars of target in terms of both the trade that comes from the UK to the US and the investment that goes from New England into the UK. We have pretty much now, the financial year ends on the 31st of March, we've hit some of those targets by 150%. I mean, Brexit hasn't slowed down that New England-UK trade, which is really reassuring to me. We've got a great team here in Boston, so that's part of it. But that for me, as somebody who is I've got a personal stake in the future of the UK in terms of specific the businesses. That's really reassuring. And some of the bigger businesses in New England, they're interested in Brexit. They want to know what's going on, but it hasn't affected their planning in terms of them going into. We're still talking to businesses every day who want to go into the UK, and that's partly because if you look at London, one of the greatest cities in the world, and I say that with some pride. I love London, it's incredible. I don't see Brexit damaging London in any significant way. I think it will still be an amazing financial centre of the world. It will still be this incredible, diverse, energetic, fantastic city that everybody wants to be in. I mean, you can move your bank to Frankfurt, but I don't think that is something that's really going to pick up a head of steam because people want to be there. We've got this fantastic mayor, Sadiq Khan, who's doing some really interesting things in London. There are problems, but I think the UK is still a fantastic place to be, and I don't think Brexit will ultimately change that.
And now you know why she's the Consul General of the United Kingdom to the New England states. And I think we'll have lots of different reads on this, and I think some economic data to counterbalance that, shall we say. But now it's time to take your questions. Again, these 4 microphones are 2 microphones up here as well. Remember to introduce yourself and have your comment end in a question mark / be a question. Go ahead.
Hello, my name's Laura. I'm British and I'm at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. So I have 2 questions. I hope that's allowed. So first of all, we briefly touched on some of the possible repercussions with a second Scottish referendum. So I thought maybe you could go into that a little bit more. And then also, I'm a junior doctor, so I just wanted to know how this might affect the future of the NHS, because we rely really heavily on EU staff. And with these sort of new immigration requirements, are we going to be able to maintain the integrity of the NHS going forward? And then second of all, can you envisage a scenario where some of these high-profile public figures, as you said earlier, lied essentially to the public, would ever be held accountable? Is there going to be some inquiry or something like that in the future that you can imagine?
Okay, Scottish referendum, Amanda.
So on the Scottish question, I could envision, I think it is very likely that you are going to have a second referendum on Scottish independence. The Scottish National Party in Scotland has been very clear on that. Nicola Sturgeon, who's the First Minister of Scotland, I heard speak in Washington last week, speak about this. She was being a little bit more coy than I think some people would like about how soon this referendum is going to be, and saying that she wants to see how Brexit settles. I think there's a couple things at play in Scotland. First, as I said, 63% 53% of Scots voted to stay in. So there's a long history in Scotland of feeling dictated to by the English and being forced to do things that they didn't support. And so this feeds into that narrative and feeds into this sense of being told what to do by London. So on one hand, you have the case for that. Second, I think you've always had Scotland having a much more European-looking perspective. They have ties with the French that go back 300 years, very supportive of the European Union because of the very rural nature of much of Scotland, much greater openness to migrants, a much greater appreciation for migrant labor, and so a different perspective on that. At the same time, if you look at Brexit, it has also opened up a number of truths for people in Scotland. One, there's a lot of voter fatigue. People already voted in a Scottish independence referendum in 2014. They then voted on Brexit in 2016, and there's been 2 general elections and elections in Scotland. So people are tired of voting. Second, it's become clear that referenda do not definitively answer political questions. We're already talking about whether to have a second Brexit referendum. We are talking about whether to have a second Scottish referendum. So there's the complexity of that. Third, we are seeing that divorce is very messy. And if it's very messy to end a 40-year marriage, think how much more complicated it's going to be to unravel a 300-year marriage. And the fourth thing that we're seeing in Northern Ireland is that it would be clear if Scotland were to become independent and then rejoin the EU, you would need to have some sort of border between Scotland and England. It would not raise the same sort of existential questions that physical infrastructure on the border raises in Northern Ireland, but it certainly would be very inconvenient to people and businesses that are operating along the border.
Harriet, the NHS, the future of the NHS. We all remember the bus. We remember the £350 million. We remember that as a key component of the Leave campaign. What's its future?
So firstly, let me say to the junior doctor, thank you for your service. I think you do amazing work. The NHS literally saved my life. I had open heart surgery when I was 7, and my cardiology care has continued throughout the NHS ever since. I still go back to St Thomas's Hospital in London for my care, even though living here in Boston, because they do some of the best care in the world. And if we're talking about Brexit as a divorce, then the NHS is the children, if you like. You have to protect them at any cost. So the government needs to make sure that we don't lose valuable, knowledgeable experts from the NHS because they're worried about what might happen to their status as EU citizens. And I think quite a lot of that messaging has been effective to a certain extent. There's a lot on the internet about the status of EU nationals in the UK at the moment, so you can look that up. But I think still more needs to be done to reassure those people and to express how much we value them. So that's really important. And the NHS needs funding because it's, as I say, it's a bedrock of the UK's identity.
And yet medical stockpiling is already going on for the worst case scenario. Ed, did you want to add something on the referendum fatigue? Because of course that is something that certain members of the Labour Party are trying to weigh as a hedge.
I think the if we have no deal or a hard Brexit where Britain leaves the customs union, in those circumstances, the economic consequences would be bad, and things are really up for grabs as far as Scotland is concerned. If we end up with a softer Brexit where the transition is longer and the economic consequences are more manageable, I think it's very unlikely that the Scottish people will want quickly to vote to change their minds. I think that the opinion polling suggests there hasn't been a shift in sentiment since the last referendum a couple of years ago. As for the EU referendum, the opinion polling also suggests there's not been a fundamental change in the British public's view since the referendum in 2016. If anything, things have polarised to the two extremes. But I think part of the concern about a second referendum is that nobody knows what the result would be. A bit like the first one, but it could quite well see a repeat of the. The same result or something close. I think that Harriet is right, that the NHS is hugely important, but the decisions the government needs to make sure it's secure are independent of issues around Brexit. Although there are some issues which, in the transition, around engagement with our European partners on medical research and regulation, and which will be important to sort out.
Amanda, last question on the accountability, given everything that you know from your vantage point of looking at the United Kingdom as a system. Do you think there's going to be some special inquiries?
I highly doubt it. We seem to be increasingly living in a world where everybody has their own facts, and I think that probably will get chalked up to the rough and tumble of political campaigning, unfortunately.
Okay, we go to you.
Hi, my name is Justin Sun. I'm a sophomore at the college studying ancient history. So Amanda and Ed kind of already talked about referenda and like referendum fatigue of them, and calls for another ones more. And last week, the Utah State Legislature voted to overturn a ballot proposal that was that passed in 2018. So my question is, what role do you see referenda in representative democracies? Are they helpful in public polling, or do you see them as kind of damaging to the institutions of a representative democracy?
Ed and Amanda have sort of gotten at that already, but go ahead, Amanda.
I mean, what was striking, I mean, the same year that we saw the Brexit referenda, we also saw the referenda fail in Colombia on the peace process. And so I think, referenda on one hand let the people decide, but the problem with referenda is they are very rarely voted on the actual, or they're often not entirely voted on the question that is being asked. I think Ed alluded to this. I mean, people can vote because they are unhappy with the government. They can vote from a place of ignorance. I mean, there's also been questions, I think, about the way the British referenda was structured. I mean, for one, there was no threshold. I mean, sometimes in referenda you say, 60% of all eligible voters have to have voted. There was no threshold there. There was no right for British nationals who were living outside the UK to be able to vote. And there's even questions about if you were to have a do-over referenda. I mean, what is the question that you even ask? Do you ask people a do-over on the initial thing? Do you want to stay in the EU or not? Do you have a referenda on the deal that Theresa May negotiated? Or do you have a multi-part question where you say, do you want to stay in, yes or no? If no, do you want Theresa May's deal? If not Theresa May's deal, do you want something else? And you can see how complicated that is. So on one hand, yes, referenda are the most ultimate expression of direct democracy, but I think depending on how they are handled, they can end up being very flawed political tools.
If the European Union were to give her any advice on that, given how well the Maastricht referenda worked, likely they would, a document now with the Brits much longer, 500 plus pages, nobody even read the Maastricht Treaty, and that was this much compared to that much. Ed?
But I think there is something kind of positive to learn from the way other countries use referenda. I mean, my view is in a parliamentary system, to use a referendum as a way of throwing a question in the air and saying, so what do you think, is a catastrophically bad way to make decisions. And we've kind of proved that. I mean, David Cameron as Prime Minister, apologies to Harriet, was saying weeks before the referendum, I still don't know which way I'm going to vote. He said, I'll get a reform package, failed to get it, and then said, but vote for it anyway. And people thought, well, if he thought it needs to be reformed and hasn't got the reforms, well, so on that, so how do we decide? I mean, does that mean the status quo was all right all along?
Right.
The right way to use referendums is to say, if the government has made a decision, supported by Parliament, then you ask the people, if it's of great constitutional significance, to endorse it. And if the people choose not to, then the government has to go back to the table and think again.
Right.
And actually, if you think about what's happened, for example, in Ireland, with the way in which they've used referendum's ratification, there is a debate, the referendum is held, the government has to go back and think hard on what it's going to do. Does it change things? Does it make extra promises? Goes back a second time. I think if you're asking for endorsement of a decision, but if you ask it, a kind of, so what do you think, yes or no? I mean, it's deeply irresponsible, and that's what we've proved, I'm afraid.
You've created deeper cracks than you ever intended. We go to you.
Hi, my name is Anon. I'm a first year at the college, but my question is about British manufacturing. I know Jaguar Land Rover has just posted its third quarter loss in a row, multi-million pound loss in a row, and companies like Bentley, Rolls-Royce, Vauxhall threatening to move production to continental Europe. What do you think is the future of British manufacturing after the Brexit deal takes place?
We're going to go Harriet and Ed. Maybe Amanda has something else to say. But Harriet, go ahead.
Yeah, let me first say I love your jumper. It's
do
really
too.
nice.
Great.
I think it's a koala bear rather than Paddington bear, but nevertheless. You make some good points about the challenges for British manufacturing, and I think part of that is the uncertainty that we're experiencing at the moment. These businesses want, they've got 5-10-year business plans, and if we don't know what's going to happen on the 30th of March, that is an enormous challenge. I would say one of the positive points when we think about British manufacturing is that I think Britain is actually very good at future manufacturing. So the kind of the sorts of innovations that are happening here in Cambridge are happening in Britain's Cambridge as well. So if you're thinking about how blockchain contributes to manufacturing, autonomous vehicles, what the UK is doing about manufacturing the new generation of antimicrobial resistant antibiotics, all that sort of stuff is absolutely happening and doesn't require the kind of physical outlay that you're talking about when you're talking about big manufacturing plants. So again, that's something that it's my job to make those connections and make sure that we promote the brilliance of what's going on in the UK, because it really is happening. And sometimes it's frustrating for me that not people here, quite genuinely, but people think about the UK and they think about red telephone boxes and the royal family, and all that is brilliant, but the brilliance of our science is also something that I want to bring to the fore as well.
And while that is true, that certainly is not going to solve, the problems of the people running the books at these major car manufacturers. And to add to your very well taken point, we've just had a study that's come out over the weekend that has shown just how many jobs, of course, car manufacturers will lose on the continent as a consequence of how interrelated these kind of manufacturing markets now are and these supply chains now are. So what's your read on that situation?
We saw GDP figures are kind of output and growth figures today, which were bad, and go exactly to Harriet's point, which is at the moment uncertainty is really stifling investment and growth. But taking a 10 or 20 year view, it entirely depends on what kind of Brexit deal you do. I've been involved with a team here, some people in the room, Mehek and Tobias, where we've done 4 papers talking to hundreds of British companies about how Brexit will affect them. They are absolutely clear that being outside the customs union is bad, particularly for manufacturing. The idea that doing trade deals with large companies, we looked at whether doing a bilateral deal with America would compensate manufacturers and wider service companies from the loss of access into the European Union if we left the customs union. And the answer is there's basically no deal on the table which could possibly compensate, and certainly not a deal that anybody would want to do or that the Americans would want to do. So there's no solution there. But from the car industry's point of view, if you have a Brexit where you are in the customs union and end up with an arrangement where the British government de facto chooses to have regulations which are the same as our European partners, you could do a deal where it wouldn't make much difference. Of course, the irony would be that we used to have an influence over those regulations, and now we would be choosing to adopt regulations being made by our European partners without our influence. So you could say that nothing would have changed other than the fact that we've lost control rather than taking back control. But if that's what you're willing to do, then you can actually you can make things okay for manufacturing. But that is a Brexit which is much, much closer to the European Union than at the moment the Prime Minister is talking about, or at least it's ambiguous as to whether she's going to be able to deliver that. A hard Brexit or no deal for, in particular, the car industry and integrated supply chains across the European Union is catastrophic, and we would lose huge amounts of jobs and investment.
Yeah. You get our last question, sir.
Oh, thank you. My name's Steve. I'm a local resident. I've been listening about the automotive industry. I've lived in Britain for 17 years, and I actually worked in the automotive industry. I worked for 3 manufacturers. So I can say that what Ed is saying is really more realistic. The government keeps taking the view that nothing's going to change after Brexit. And I can tell you that having worked for Honda, for example, that after Brexit, that factory will be at risk in Swindon because they won't be able to run the just-in-time system, particularly that for Nissan up in Sunderland, they just announced that they're not going to be producing the X-Trail. That's going to Japan. So there's a lot of moving parts. But but I didn't want to talk about the automotive industry, but the conversation kind of went that way. Do you think there's a risk that the EU could get their act together, become a better oiled machine, so to speak, without the British veto in future? So, for Britain's interest, would it be better for Britain to have a strong EU unified if they can get their act together politically and work things out? So, just want to see if there's any comments on that, because the whole conversation has been all about Britain leaving and having Britain bend, the EU is going to bend to Britain's will. So
it's an interesting spin on the question, because if you think about it, it's interesting that in its current incarnation, we have a very British European Union, because of course, what the UK had long advocated for was a wider union that was looser in its political construct. And here we are, in some respects, that exact image with the UK leaving. So Amanda, as somebody who has seen it from both sides of the channel, what's your read on that?
I think it's a great question. One thought, I completely agree with everything that Ed was just saying in the last round. I think the UK is going to have to make a fundamental decision about whether or not they want to closely align in regulatory terms with the EU. The closer they align, the easier it's going to be for the bulk of their trade, the easier it's going to be to handle the border in Northern Ireland. The more distance they have, the easier it's going to be for them to negotiate free trade agreements, but those I think are going to be quite difficult. If you look at the US, if you want to freak out a British person, talk to them about American chlorinated chicken. And genetically modified food, which is going to be what the U.S. is going to force them to take. And if you look at who they're likely to look at for some of their free trade agreements, it's going to be Commonwealth countries who presumably are going to want an element of free labor for their people. And if the Brits don't want Polish plumbers coming in, they're probably not going to want people from Commonwealth countries moving there either. On this question, you can think about this from a couple different perspectives. One, in the EU, even though I think it's very frustrating from an American perspective to try and deal with as it struggles to become a single political entity, is the reality of getting 28 countries to agree on anything is actually pretty extraordinary when you look at what they are really trying to do. And certainly the UK, as has been discussed before, has been much more skeptical about this, I think has slowed some things down. You've ended up with a two-speed Europe. And so there is potential for the EU to be able to move forward a little bit more quickly there. At the same time, I think we're also seeing a lot of deep divisions within the EU. We have democratic backsliding happening in countries in Central Europe. We have countries like France that are one bad election away from having similar populist leaders like you have in places like Italy and some of these Central European countries. I think the European Parliament elections in May are going to be quite telling to look at. The irony of that is that over the history of the EU, we have moved towards giving increasing power to the European Parliament. It is now more powerful than it has ever been. And some people are suggesting that you could now have a third of the members of the European Parliament being represented by either populist parties, nationalist parties, or parties that are skeptical of the European project itself. Not to mention Europe having been torn apart by the financial crisis and the refugee crisis. So on one hand, yes, removing some British obstinance makes things a little bit easier. On the other hand, I think the EU has a lot of internal challenges as it is. And then there's, of course, the whole American dynamic with a lot of questions about whether the U.S. is increasingly withdrawing from Europe and whether or not that is going to be some sort of instigating force to get Europe to try and develop some sort of greater capacity either on the security front or on the political front.
I'll just let Ed go last and look at this moment that I've already mentioned, this March 21st European Council, because I do think that Theresa May might be hedging a little bit to, in that sense, break the European Union apart, because she'll want certain components, certain leadership potentially to come and save certain components of her plans. What is the likelihood of that, getting that right, or allowing or making space for that? Or is that just all, or is the European Union going to continue coalescing behind Michel Barnier and Sabine Weigand, and with the staunch piece that there's no brief, there's no hair between the rest EU members in a great effort to prevent these kind of crumbling structures that Amanda has just alluded to, not to let those fissures rise?
Well, I should say, by the way, Amanda referring to the prospects of a successful and meaningful US-UK trade agreement as quite difficult. Felt to be like classic British understatement, if you don't mind me saying that to America. It's going to be much worse and quite difficult. I think the answer in terms of the European Council, first of all, is that I don't think anybody in Britain at the moment expects any big substantial shift in the European position at that European Council. If Theresa May is hoping for that, I don't think she's going to get it. However, our European partners don't want, I think, a no deal, because I think they know that would be bad for them as well as for us. And they don't want to be seen to have been unreasonable. And therefore, that's why I think if in the end Britain goes back asking for more time, or if Britain is asking for some reassurance in the political declaration around the backstop, my view is that our European partners will be willing to do something to try and help. And Theresa May's gamble will be that anything might be enough to unblock her the votes. This then goes, I think your question there goes to a deeper question about Britain's relationship with Europe. I mean, the reality is that we have always been a bit odd about Europe, and we have a kind of exceptionalist view, and it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. The fact is, our European partners have been quite willing to indulge our differences. I mean, they allowed us to opt out of Maastricht. They allowed us not to be in Schengen. I think as long as British prime ministers look like they are supporting the overall project, we've always been cut some slack. And our big mistake was not to appreciate that enough. And so at this point, we're kind of asking for another big round of slack to be cut. We've had quite a lot of that over the years. On the other hand, I think it's important our European partners don't get too locked into a mindset which says this is just some British problem. Because as Amanda said, I mean, the kind of things which we've seen happen here in America, the kind of things which we've seen happen in Britain, the kind of rise of nationalist, anti-government, anti-establishment, frustrated popular movements, we're seeing those in France, and clearly in Italy, and clearly in Germany. It's not Britain which is causing those things to happen. Europe is not immune from those things. I think that Europe has been pleased that Britain was not in the euro. I think it would have been terrible for Europe if we had been. But some of the other things which have affected us are affecting our European partners as well. If European governments think they're okay because they can sort of be centralist or unaccountable or a bit elitist, and they'll get away with it, I think that's correct. If they think that they can just carry on saying free movement is a founding tenet of the European Union, and it may be not working in America or Britain, but we are immune, I think that is unwise.
Yeah.
I think we're ahead of the curve, but a lot of these pressures are happening in European countries as well. So if there's to be a new settlement where governments are more open and trusted, they deliver more equality for citizens, and they manage globalization better, that is something which is going to have to be led by our European partners as much as us. And if they think that populism and that kind of reaction is just simply an Anglo-Saxon disease, I think that's very, very dangerous for Europe.
I think that's good advice to be going out into the world from the Kennedy School on this evening, because that's what we are ultimately here for, is trying to figure out how we can prepare the next generation for better ideas in governance and to not see these problems as isolated, because as all three of you have pointed out, we are in a globalized world, despite the fact that Theresa May thought in her big policy speech that she could insulate, but clearly we're not, whether it's manufacturing or politics or governance that we're looking at. We could go on for another hour and a half digging into these deep complexities. It's riveting to watch from the outside. It's painful to watch from both the side of the European Union and the United Kingdom. The clock is clicking down. The brinksmanship is real. It is a political thriller of the highest order, and we'll soon know some answers. At least we'll look for March 29th for a little more clarity. Thank you for joining us on this panel to try to shed exactly that. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.